What's popping, guys? In this video I'm going to be covering the life of the English scientist who made contributions to many different fields including mathematics, optics, mechanics, architecture and astronomy. The life of Robert Hooke starts similar to many classical tales of a self-made man from humble beginnings who ended up contributing to the world and rubbing shoulders with some of the West's greatest minds while making a pretty penny doing so. Born on July 28, 1635 in Freshwater, Isle of Wight, England, Robert's childhood was not much different to many other kids at that time. He experienced poor health and wasn't expected to reach adulthood. Yet, despite his health, his father, a clergyman, still attempted to educate his brother and his other son, Robert Hooke, by being their private tutor. However, after a certain amount of time, Robert's parents realized that Robert's health refused to get any better and the parents gave up on educating him and left him to his own devices. It was here where Robert, although being physically limited, continued to push his mind to whatever seemed remotely possible or interesting to him at the time. Because he didn't go to school, his mind mostly remained uncluttered to the preconceived learnings and such. Therefore, he was able to develop his own ideas and conclusions and build his desired skills. More specifically, two particular skills that he acquired was his observational and mechanical skills. He spent an awful lot of time observing the plants, the animals, the farm, the rocks, the cliffs and sea and the beaches around him. And for the latter skill, he obtained through sheer fascination with mechanical toys and clocks, often making many things from wood, ranging from a working clock to even a fully modelled toy ship that actually shoots stuff. Hooke continued this life of letting his imagination and talents run riot up to the age of 10, when his father actually came ill and died not long after. Now, with his father gone into the afterlife, Robert's family needed financial support, and from a young age they noticed that Hooke had a talent in drawing, as if being a multifaceted science prodigy wasn't enough, from seeing how fast he emulated a local painter in his town. What they did was they sent him down to London to apprentice to the well-known portrait painter Peter Lely. Once reaching London, Hooke decided that it would be a waste of money to learn how to paint under this individual. Instead, what he believed was he needed an education, so he enrolled into Westminster. Shortly after joining the school, the headmaster, Richard Busby, took a notice of Hooke's talent and work ethic real quick. Considering that Hooke had only been at Westminster for a week, he already grasped the first 6 books of geometry masterpiece, Euclid's Elements. Seeing this, Busby let Hooke learn whatever he wanted and to be free, just like he was before he joined Westminster. During his stay at Westminster, Hooke learned Greek and Latin and rapidly expanded his knowledge on geometry and applied it to his deep love for mechanics, and even began to build a potential flying machine. A few years later, in 1653, Hooke believed that he exhausted the school in terms of what they could offer him to learn next, so he joined Christ College in Oxford. Similar to most 18-year-olds today, Hooke had run out of money. He needed to find a way to support himself throughout his studies at Oxford because he didn't really come from a wealthy family. Fortunately for him, he was able to get a position as an assistant to the popular Anglo-Irish natural philosopher, physicist, chemist Robert Boyle. Working together, they managed as expected to achieve a great deal lot. The very first project that they worked on essentially created the first modern air pump. Hooke was someone who never really did one thing at a time. He seemed his best when his mind was jumping from one idea to another. And at the same time on working on the air pump, he was also thinking about clocks and how they could be used to determine the longitude of the sea. Realizing the weakness of the pendulum clock in keeping time on a ship which was pitching and tossing around on sea, he thought to himself, use of springs instead of gravity for making a bond vibrate in any posture, as you do. So, around 1658, he began his experiments and made significant improvements in just 2 years. In 1660, 2 years later, regarding the balance controlled by a spiral spring and the improved escapement called the anchor escapement, which is widely used in pendulum clocks. However, while working on these 2 experiments, the key thing that Hooke discovered was now aptly called Hooke's law. Without getting too technical, Hooke's law essentially states that when an elastic object, such as a spring or a catapult, is stretched out. The difference between the relaxed state of the spring and the stretched spring is called extension. So this means that the extension of an elastic object is directly proportional to the force applied to it. This is until you go past something called the limit of proportionality by damaging the spring or stretching it out too much to the point where the spring or the object is actually deformed. The formula for this is F equals minus kx. If you're interested in this type of stuff, specifically Hooke's law of elasticity, one of the best books I can recommend is called Structures, or Why Things Don't Fall Down by J.E. Gordon. It covers this law and so many other technical stuff in such a non-technical way. It's a fantastic book, and this is why Elon Musk recommends it himself. Shortly after Hooke's first publication on capillary action, a petition was requested so that King Charles II to recognise them as a society. And it was at this point the Royal Society of London was born. And as soon as it started, most of the members already had in mind that Hooke was going to be the top guy, the curator of experiments. This was essentially someone who was in charge of overseeing all the experiments. Considering that this was a very respectable position and it seemed like a good deal, you have to read the small print. As the curator, you must put forward 3 or 4 experiments which are either massive improvements or new at every meeting they had. So now 27 reacted to this impossible task by producing a wealth of original ideas over the next 15 years. It would be fair to say that it was through Hooke's flood of ideas that the society properly prospered, but equally the demands brought out Hooke's genius to the front. Although these demands meant that Hooke never really had the chance to develop his ideas over time as you would expect a leading scientist. But to be fair, I think this works well with his personality from working and jumping from one idea to another. And if this wasn't enough, he also took another position as a professor at the Gresham College in London, which required him to take 1 lesson a week. Also within the same year of 1665, Hooke produced his first masterpiece called Micrograffia, which brought him scientific fame in the community. The book contained some of the most accurate and detailed drawings of insects that the world had ever seen at that time. What made this possible was the fact that he had many years of drawing under his belt, and the fact that he actually used something called a microscope, which was almost new at that time in the scientific community. Using this device, he was the first person to coin the name cell when referring to cellular systems of the body. After Hooke's publication, he was really able to showcase his knowledge on such a vast array of subjects such as wave theory of light and light in general. Shortly after, he went on and built one of the first Gregorian reflecting telescopes. Using this device, he was able to make another discovery stating that Jupiter spins on his own axis, which he got from observing the spots. It must have been a very eventful year for those living in 1660 London, having just fought off the Black Death, also known as the Great Plague, and then being greeted with another thing called a fire. Fires were pretty commonplace in those days. However, this fire was a bit different. It had just come from a hot summer and there had been no rain for weeks, which is pretty much rare as a purple carrot. This meant that the wooden houses and the other buildings around were tinned dry. As soon as the fire started, around 300 houses were burnt down, and the strong eastern wind made the fire accelerate even quicker. By the end of the destruction, the Great Fire had caused around 87 churches and 13,200 houses to completely be demolished. With one of the side careers of Robert Hooke being a visionary, he teamed up with the highly acclaimed Christopher Wren architect to build up the city once again. It was at this time in 1666 where he solidified his status as one of the best British thinkers the world has ever seen. Despite dedicating most of his life to science, Robert Hooke's life is not really well known among the general population in comparison to his rival, Isaac Newton. These two geniuses not only shared the same era or the same city, they actually almost shared the same work too. At the peak of Hooke's career, there was a confrontation between him and Newton, stating that it was he who had given him the notion that led him to the law of universal gravitation. Hooke, having the personality that he did, he demanded to have the credit as the author of the idea, and Newton essentially said no. He denied it. Later, as these feuds got a little bit more intense, a third party got involved, asking both men to bring their mathematical proofs together to decide who actually bought it first. And apparently only Newton did. This hatred for each other lasted literally throughout both of their lives. Newton, however, lived 25 years longer than Hooke and very much tried to remove any mention of Hooke in the history books. He managed to do this pretty well considering the fact that he had such high fame and status at this point after producing his hit book Principia. It was these mentality of the scientists at that time that literally left the progress of elasticity to be minimal, even in the 18th century. They all believed that each of their ideas in their particular areas was enough to be the next big technological breakthrough, so they didn't really contribute to each other's idea or very rarely collab. However, it doesn't really help when Robert Hooke, shortly after discovering the law of elasticity, he wrote the idea and the proofs in anagram so that other scientists wouldn't be able to copy the idea and steal his royalties later on. Other scientists like Galileo and Huygens did this too. Robert Hooke, the son of a clergyman, a remote village in England, died on March 3rd, 1703, as one of England's most brilliant minds, or better yet, the Renaissance man of England. What exactly can we learn from his life? One of the key things I could take away from doing all this research and concluding in this video is the fact that if you're going to bounce around from one idea to another, make sure you're willing to let the credit be taken away from the ideas you didn't fully pursue to the end. A perfect example of this is literally shown in Robert Hooke's life, where he continued to bounce from one idea to another, not thinking about all the ideas that other scientists could take off him and contribute and expand and over time take the credit for. If you're willing to start many ideas, make sure you're willing to give the credit away later on. And don't complain about it if they take your idea, if you didn't expand on it. The second lesson I could take from Robert Hooke's life is the fact that when confronting Isaac Newton, though they might be similar in terms of mental capacity and intelligence, it was not really worth it for Robert Hooke to take the risk to fight him. The reason for this was the risk to reward ratio for Robert Hooke wasn't really worth it. You would have got a lot of credit if you won the battle with Isaac Newton. However, if he decided to pursue other goals, he still would have been cited into Isaac Newton's book and potentially expanded his ideas on others to further give him credit. So if you're going to fight for something, make sure it's actually much higher than you, not the same level or lower. Another real life example that comes to mind is from 50 Cent's book, Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter. He had the opportunity to get in a confrontation with a show that was clashing with his show, which is called Power. But instead, he denied them and gave them no attention at all. And instead, he picked a battle with a bigger show called the Game of Thrones. And even though he lost, he still would have acquired the attention of the Game of Thrones viewer to even increase the viewership slightly. That's a smart move. Thanks for watching. Peace.